Ladies and gentlemen, gamers and game developers, noobs and pros, haters and lovers. Guess who? We're back! My name is Andres Fire and welcome back to Gameology Conversations. Apologies for the long absence. Been busy making games rather than talking about them. But we're back, yeah! We have a great lineup of interviews with amazing people working on games we all love. But as an apology, in this episode we have a special guest, a very awesome girl named Liz England. She's a game designer, assistant designer in amazing games like Scribblenauts, Saints Row 2, Resistance 3 Fuse, and one of my favorite games of all the time, Sunset Overdrive. Please make a sequel. She's working at Ubisoft Toronto right now, and for all her co-workers, gotta say, you're so lucky to have a chance to work with Liz. Yeah. Okay, enough talk, let's go on. Damn, it's going to be more talk. But very helpful stuff. I'm serious, the things you can learn in this episode is beyond your expectations. Let's do this! Ring and hello, and thank you so much for doing this interview with me, Liz. This means a lot to me because of many reasons. First, I'm a big fan of yours, and I've learned a lot from you by following your speeches and blogs. Second, I love your games. Sunset Overdrive especially is on the list of my top favorite games of all the time. Third, we have the same job. I'm a game designer too, and I'm excited to learn many things from you in this interview. I have to tell them, man. We're doing this for a second time because I screwed up and I didn't record the last one.
So we're pretending that he didn't screw up, and we're going to try and do this from scratch again.
And fourth, you're a cool gal. I was watching your GDC presentation on Sunset Overdrive, and I was stunned by your humbleness and also eagerness to share your knowledge with others. So thank you for being such a nice person. I'm talking like
thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Congratulations on a new position on Ubisoft Toronto. Last time I said Ubisoft Toronto. Yeah.
Oh, you can say Ubisoft or Ubisoft or whatever. I think they're both fine.
Well, let's skip the thing that I said that might cause problem. Okay, let's start with your background. One fact that I always get motivation from is biography of the successful people who I look up to. Please tell us about the journey you've traveled and to get to be the amazing Liz England that you are.
Okay, so it starts a long time ago. I was born at a very young age. I lived in New York. And I feel like I'm part of the first generation of kids that really, we played games all the time. Like, games were completely normal. Like, my mom played games all the time. I'd come home from school and she'd be playing a game. My dad played games. My brother and I, we played and we fought over games constantly. And that was kind of... Huh?
I'm sorry. So when you ended up being a game developer yourself, they were proud. Yeah. They were like my dad. Like, what do you do? Oh, I'm making games.
Yeah. Well, yes. Yeah. So there's a few people who understand that I'm making games, as opposed to the rest of my family who have never touched a game in their life. Yeah. So that was really cool. That games were just totally normal. They were not it's not unusual to spend, all weekend playing video games, and that was fine in our household, thank goodness. But anyway, at the time, I thought I wanted to be an English teacher, so I went to college and I enrolled in an English degree. So I studied English literature. Mm-hmm. I decided I did not want to be a teacher. That's a whole other story. But I was getting ready to graduate with a literature degree, and I studied medieval literature, so it was all Old English and Beowulf and Chaucer, and there's lots of. I did my undergrad thesis on monsters, so you can tell. It's academic, sure, but it's really I wrote about monsters.
Monster specialist.
Yes. Oh man, I could go on forever about what makes something a monster, but that's besides the point. Anyway, it was a lot of fun, but like most people who are about to graduate with a humanities degree, I started to panic and say, okay, well, what can I do with this? What kind of job can I take? Before that, I thought maybe I'd go into publishing, maybe I'd go into advertisement. Advertisement's pretty soulless. Don't do it. But there's elements of design and creating things that were really interesting to me. And I didn't want to go into academia academia because that to me just felt like I was researching stuff other people had already made, and I kind of wanted to make something myself.
Yeah.
So a friend of mine was actually looking at becoming a games programmer, and I was like, oh, games, is that actually a job? Like, I never really thought about all the video games I played and be like, oh, there's people that are actually making these. You know, I think the closest I got was like, you know, the cutscenes in a Final Fantasy game. I was like, oh, these artists are so talented. I think it's as close as I got to thinking that there were people behind the games I played. So yeah, I started looking at it. I learned that game design was actually a thing. I had never known that game design was anything before. And then you know, and kind of like this moment of panic, I looked for a master's program in the U.S. that I could get, you know, a master's degree in game design or something related to game design. And at the time, there was only one school doing that, and that was Southern Methodist University in Texas. They had a Guildhall program that's still going today. And it was very vocational oriented. I was kind of lucky in that, like, a lot of my interests before then were like, I was interested in technology, so I'd already taken some computer programming courses just because, just for fun, I guess. I'm one of the weird people. And I had taken lots of art classes and digital media classes, so I knew like really briefly how to use 3D modeling and stuff. And that was just like before I even thought games were a thing. So I was kind of lucky in that I had a bunch of these sort of broad and shallow basis of like technical skills that made it a lot easier for me to catch up with everybody else who had probably been doing modding for, you know, the last few years and stuff like that. So I went to school. I did a master's program. I have let me see if I remember the name of the master's. My master's degree is in the Masters of Interactive Technology in Digital Game Development, specializing in level design, minoring in art. I forgot the rest last time I talked to you. That's the whole. It's a huge mouthful, so I just even call it a Masters of Interactive Technology. But really, it was very vocational. It was very based off of learn the tools and do a lot of work in those tools that are similar to the kind of work that you do in a AAA studio. Yeah. So I did a lot of mods in things like Half-Life 2, and I did an Oblivion mod that was awesome and terribly broken now, and that makes me sad, but you'll just have to take my word for it. It was an awesome RPG mod. I did maps in Portal 2 and in Unreal and things like that. I did multiplayer maps and single player maps. It was very level design focused, very much focused on like creating a lot of content and getting better through practice. And that actually worked really well for me. Yeah. I was able to develop a portfolio, which is like, if you read my site, that's like the number one thing for getting a job, is getting a good portfolio for a designer. And while I was there, I actually had a really good opportunity. I interned at a company called Volition, which was making Saints Row 2 at the time. Yeah. And that was a ton of fun.
Amazing game.
Oh yeah, and at the time I was like, I don't know if I want to work on something called Saints Row 2. I'm like, this is really not my kind of game. And then I went and worked on it. I was like, oh, this is really my kind of game. It kind of taught me. It was a really good lesson to have, that I could work on games that I may not necessarily play regularly at home, and like I can learn to appreciate a genre and appreciate like what is cool about that genre, even if I don't have much prior experience to it. It's one of those things that a lot of designers need to learn, because most of the time when you're in the industry, you're not necessarily making the kinds of games that you would play at home. You know, most people are making, you know, kids games and like things like that. Like when I talk to my coworkers, one of my favorite designers, the game he's most proud of is actually an Ashley and Kate Olsen fashion game for the DS, and it's not a game he would ever play himself. But you know, being able to work on other types of games is really cool, and it's an important skill. Anyway, let's see. Okay, so after Volition, after I interned and I got my master's, a little company in Seattle contacted me called Fifth Cell. And they were like, you have an English degree, and that's really relevant to our interests. And so they interviewed me, and then they brought me up to Seattle, and they showed me it wasn't even a game, it was just a concept for a game that they were going to work on called Scribblenauts. And Scribblenauts, for those who don't know, is this game where you can write any object. You can write down any noun, basically, as long as it's not copyrighted or it's vulgar. You can write turnip or ninja or whale or egg, you know, anything you want. and it spawns into the game, and then you can use it like you normally would. So,
what happens when you write Liz England?
Oh, so there's always all the developers were in there. So Liz England, it depends on which game you're playing. So in the first game when you spawn Liz England, I'm a female zombie, and I eat art. And then in the second game, I'm a female pirate, and I believe I steal art. And then in the third game, which is the one I left during, I think my fellow developers were confused and they didn't know which to do. So I look like a zombie and I steal art. But yeah, there's so many Easter eggs in that game, and it was a lot of fun to work on. It was a very unusual project, I like to describe it as like the 2 years I spent reading Wikipedia, and I have all this knowledge that would be great in trivia, but I don't know. There's not enough trivia that asks me things like, what makes badgers drunk? And that's the trivia I know, not like who released a music album at what year. So I got a lot of useless knowledge in my head from that game. But it was a lot of fun, and it was one of those like weird, impossible design tasks I couldn't say no to. And I'm really glad that I worked on it. But at the time, like after I worked on 2 of the games, when I got to the third, I was kind of feeling antsy. I wanted to do something different, and I'd always been interested in AAA. And like I obviously, like I've been playing Ratchet and Clank games since I was a kid, and like
but you didn't make one.
I didn't make one. No,
you were working on Insomniac. I love that game, but you didn't make one.
I worked there for 5 years and I didn't work on a single Ratchet and Clank. However, I got lots of free copies of Ratchet and Clank games. I can play them as a player. So, and I'm still looking forward to the new one. I haven't played it yet. Don't spoil it for me. Yeah. So I went and applied at Insomniac and got the job. That was nice. And I worked on Resistance 3, which is a first-person shooter. I helped finish that game up. Then I worked on Fuse, which was a 4-player co-op cover shooter. Yeah. And then I worked on Sunset Overdrive, which is like Sunset Overdrive and Scribblenauts were both like highlights of my career. You can tell that Sunset Overdrive was a lot of fun to make. Like you couldn't be an unfun person and make that. It was a blast. I liked a lot of hard work, a lot of like that impossible work that reminds me of working on Scribblenauts because it was our first open world game. And we'd only ever made like these linear games. Yeah. And so it was a bit of a beast to tackle, but it was a fun one to work on, And then after that, I worked for the last year I was at Insomniac. I was working on their VR projects before I made the leap over to Ubisoft, which is where I'm at now. Faith. Yes, a leap of faith. Definitely.
If you play Assassin's Creed, you understand.
Yes, I understand. Over to Ubisoft. I'm very happy there now. I've been there for about 4 months, 3 months. Still in the honeymoon phase.
You've been working in a lot of studios in different countries. Was it hard to travel all the way up to Canada? I mean, how does work affect your personal life?
Oh, yeah. So, as you might guess, I'm kind of dealing with that right now because I've only been here for 3 months, so I'm still kind of like...
dealing with the cold.
Yeah. Well, okay. It's finally... So today, and it is May 14th. Today is the same weather it was in LA on February 14th. I left. It was very cold. Oh my gosh. I call Toronto north of the wall. If you watch Game of Thrones, we are north of the wall, the wildlings. It's so cold up here. I'm not used to it from LA. But yeah, it was hard moving, because it's hard leaving all my friends behind and uprooting and going to a new place in a new country. And I have family in Toronto, so that helps ease the transition a bit. I'm actually a dual citizen, so I'm both a Canadian and an American citizen. So that made some of the immigration stuff a lot simpler. But it's still lots of headaches and lots of headaches moving between countries. One of the nice things, at least about game development, is that when they say that like we're a really small, close-knit group that everybody knows everyone, it's true, right? Mm-hmm. So there's lots of conferences that lots of developers go to, especially like GDC, which is in March in San Francisco, and that's local enough. I mean, for me in Toronto, it's local enough. Maybe not for Tehran. That's a lot further away. Yeah. Where I can make the pilgrimage to GDC once a year, see a bunch of my old friends that I haven't had in contact with, and re-up that contact. And the thing happens when you go to other conventions like PAX and things like that. And we all know that like I'm likely to be working with a bunch of them again. Actually, one of the guy that I interned under at Volition, I'm working with again now. So it really is a small industry, and people cycle through it, and so you see people again. So that's nice. Uprooting's hard, but I don't know. I've done it before.
Yeah. When you want to work in a studio, what qualifications are you concerned about? Does it matter what type of games they make?
So yeah, this is an interesting question, because I'd actually say, so it depends on the person, right? For me, I can only talk about myself, right? For me, it's not actually about the game that they're making. It's about like what kind of challenges I'm going to experience as a designer, like where that will put me future career wise, right? Like when I took the job at Fitcell working on Scribblenauts, it was because this is this impossible design challenge that no one really knew how to tackle. Like how do you catalog every object in the world, in the universe, and make them usable into a game? Go figure that out. And like, oh yeah, sure, I'll do that. That sounds like fun. And it was a totally different challenge than anything I'd ever heard of. But by the time I got to the third game, like the challenge wasn't there anymore, and I was kind of looking for something else. And at that time, the challenge I was looking for was I wanted to work in AAA. I wanted to work at a company that had like people with a lot more experience than me. So like at Fitcell, I don't think anybody had 10 years of experience in the industry. But like at Insomniac, you had people celebrating their 20th year anniversaries at that company. Well, just about, because the company just hit the 20th year. I don't want to lie. But yeah, people had been around for a long time, and like it's really cool and humbling to be the noob. You know, I have 3 years of experience, and you're sitting next to someone who has 15 years of experience and has worked on games that you remember when you were a kid. And being able to sit next to them, and now they're peers, and now you're learning directly from them, and they're giving you not just anecdotes from the games that they make. It's like they're teaching you, right? Like that was like the best teaching experience I could get, was to work with people who know a whole lot more than I do. And so there was that, and then there was also like AAA specializes a lot more. So and there's like this level of quality and I don't know, maybe professionalism that goes into the work that I really wanted to try. Yeah. So at a company like Fitcell, like everybody wore a lot of hats because there were only like 20 people on the project. So I did pixel art, I did some UI design, I hooked up sound effects and things like that. And I did all kinds. I did level designs. I did systems design. I did all that. But at a AAA company, it's like, no, you're a designer now. You know, I get to work a lot closely with like other specialists, right? So instead of working with one artist on the entire team, you know, it's like there's a team of artists, and they're separated between animators and modelers and concept artists and things like that. And there's a lot of perks that come with that, right? Like a lot of people are really specialized in their individual skills, and I learn a lot more about my own special. Like I get to dive deep design. There we go. That's what I want to say. And that was cool. So like working on Resistance was like, I didn't play first-person shooters before I worked on Resistance, and I was afraid I was going to find out. Oh no, she's an imposter. But it worked out all right, and they didn't really care so long as my work was good. And my work was good, and I learned a lot about the genre. But I learned a lot about making combat setups in the same way I worked on Fuse. I learned a lot about how to make games for multiplayer, how to make combat setups, how to do all this kinds of stuff that I had never done before. And Sunset Overdrive, that was our first open world game, and no one really had any open world experience on the team. So I was like,
But you've been working on Saints Row 2. You had experience.
Yes. Actually, that was the joke that I made on the team. I was like, I have the most open world experience of all, because I interned on an open world game. Yeah, so that wasn't very helpful. But yeah, like there's a lot of new challenges that we had never dealt with, and like being able to deal with those challenges like really invigorates me. Mm-hmm. And then I went on to VR, and like there's some challenges with VR, but ultimately it didn't grab me the way I was expecting it to. Yeah. And so I just didn't have any challenges anymore. And I wasn't doing systems design, right? So when I was working on Sunset Overdrive, I got to do systems full time. We can talk about systems design later, if you want. But what I was really, and Sunset Overdrive was awesome to work on. So I was like, okay, I need to work on another game that's an open world game where I do all systems. What other companies give me that? So I was kind of lucky in that Ubisoft actually reached out to me, and I was like, oh well, let's see what they have. And that's how I ended up at Ubisoft Toronto, which is I get to do systems full time on something that I would consider challenging, that I've never done before.
Wow.
Right, and so I find that that's what I tend to look for. Is like, as time has gone by, I've been more focused on, okay, well, actually, it's systems that I want. But the thing that's the same across the board is always making sure that whatever I'm working on is challenging. And so it doesn't matter what genre it is. Although I'm probably the worst suited for an esport game. Generally, it doesn't matter what genre it is, so much as like what I am doing physically, like at my day-to-day work. If that's like challenging and that's, the edge of my skills, then it's perfect.
Yeah. Now, I read somewhere that you said exactly, I quote, when you're a student, you can't afford to fail. When you're a professional, you can. So don't be afraid to take risk. Now, in my case, it was completely opposite when I started out.
I don't think I said that, because I would have said the opposite.
See? I have the proof. I'll send it to you.
Did I send it? Did you see?
Yeah, I started completely opposite. I was hired as the lead game designer. Imagine I was 18 or 19 in a studio full of people older than me. Now, those days were really horrifying, because I found out the responsibility of a game designer is really the most crucial one. I mean, the other departments have their own concern to be worried about, but the lead designer especially is a guy or gal who should have eyes on everything.
Right.
One mistake can always be traced to the designer. So what do you suggest for the beginners who got their first job as a designer in a studio? They're banging head against the wall.
Okay, so I will correct myself. I believe that I totally messed up and I said the opposite of what I meant, which is that fail as a student. I have some very good memories of terrible failures I made as a student, but I have carried the lessons on, and I have never made that mistake again, now that it would cost my company a lot of money. But you were asking like advice for people on their first job?
Yeah. Especially the game designers.
It's hard. I mean, what I did was I'm very like open in terms of go to people and ask them to help me, or go to people and ask them, what do you need me to do? What, like, if I find myself, I remember when I was an intern, and then when I was first starting, I was like, I'm kind of like, I'm not sure if I'm going in the right direction or something like that. So I'd be like, I need to sit down with somebody more senior than me to go over my work briefly. There's a balance between doing that and like monopolizing people's work, or monopolizing their time, and trying to have a good balance with that. But I think, I don't know. I'm drifting because I'm thinking about this. I think it's sort of like, some people are a little embarrassed to ask when they don't know something, and I think you should just own it and just ask when you don't know something, and then just try to remember it and not have to ask the same. As long as you're not asking the same questions over and over again, you're fine. Like there's so much. Game design is so complicated, and there's so much to learn. And especially if you're new, everybody around you knows that you're new, or know that you're going to need help. I always have a philosophy where I rotate the asking of help. I don't ask the same person all the time, because I don't want them to know how little I know. But I also don't want to, steal all their time. So I'll rotate, and I'll ask somebody else next time, and I'll ask somebody else next time. And that also helps with getting to know the rest of the team and them getting to know you.
Yeah. Now, was it hard for you to start as a girl in this industry? Because I've heard stories about Jade Raymond having problems starting out because she was a woman.
Yeah. No, it wasn't hard, actually. So everyone's got their own experiences, and I say no that it wasn't hard because it's probably about as hard as if it were any other industry for me. I've been pretty lucky. But I have had bad experiences, and I have heard the whispers of bad experiences. And I've had to make certain decisions. Like, there was one company that gave me an offer, and I was really excited to work for. And then I found out from people I knew at the company that, you know, a lot of the designers would go to the strip club every Friday as a kind of thing that they did together. I'm like, well, obviously I wouldn't be part of that. Sounds like very much of a bro culture. They make great games, but I don't think I'm going to fit there. And they were really upset that I didn't take the offer. And I'm like, well, I'm not sure if I can tell you why I didn't accept the offer, but maybe you should like look around a little carefully at your culture. So that sort of thing seems to have been like, there's less and less of that now. Like that was in 2008, and even then it was kind of like not normal. Right? The bro culture at studios, and I've been kind of like, I've been able to be really picky about jobs. I've had multiple offers before, so I've been able to be like really picky about who I go to work for. And I don't have to say, well, it's a job, right? Let's take it. And the other thing is like a lot of people will dismiss or insult AAA. For a variety of reasons. But one of the great advantages is like there's a level of professionalism at AAA. It's like they're not going to put up with like that kind of sexism in the workplace. Maybe not at all studios, and each studio has its own set of culture. But it's definitely one of the advantages. Like if there are women listening to the podcast, like get a job at AAA, and they usually treat you pretty. Like it's really hard. It's really easy for a really small studio of like 20 people to turn toxic. But yeah, like even as a woman, like I haven't really had much trouble. And that's my personal experience, right? Like if you listen to every year at GDC, there's a One Reason to Be panel, and this year is actually about like largely international developers. But last year and the year before was all about women. And I think the talk is, I think GDC publishes the talk free. And the prior year, Amy Hennig, who's the creative director on the Uncharted series at the time, she gave a talk that resonated with me, which was like, you know, come in, the water is fine, right? Yeah. Which is like, she can only talk about her experience, and her experience was largely positive, which is, you know, sure, I'm surrounded by men, and that can be a little bit disheartening at times. I would really like to have another woman on my team, but I'm surrounded by a lot of men that have really helped nurture and mentor me as well. And like, I want to, you know, they deserve a shout out as well. And I'm very thankful to them that they, you know, believed in me and helped mentor me and helped train me and help me become a better designer. And I would have no hesitation to recommend the game industry to other women, but other women have had bad experiences too. And that's like, I don't want my experience to overwrite theirs, you know? Yeah. So I admit and accept that there are bad experiences, and I know a lot of women who have had bad experiences, and sometimes it's just the luck of the draw, and luck can be very much against you. Yeah. So it's hard, but you can be lucky, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. So I've definitely been on the lucky side. I haven't had much trouble with being a woman.
Thank God for that. Let's talk about game design documentation. Mm-hmm. About 5 months ago, I quit my job and started a company with my friends called Try Again, and an indie studio. Back when I was working at studios, I was very serious about my GDD. Every aspect of the game was precisely documented, but now I don't write very much. You know, of course, some basic must be written because you can't memorize numbers and stuff. But the fact that we don't write anything and mostly communicate in every way which is more suitable is far more exciting and precise for me. You know, because sometimes you write down something and it feels like it's there forever, you know, and it feels like you can't go back and change it. And if you do, you gotta inform like everybody, and there's a whole new problem. And I don't say documentation is wrong. I say it's not the only way, but of course, when you're working on a huge game like Assassin's Creed, that you might think now. And so many people are involved. You got to have everything written down. So let's talk about it. What do you think about documentation? How do you work, and what are your tools and approaches?
Well, as you know, I gave a talk on documentation last year at GDC a few months ago. You didn't know that. Yeah, so...
I'm going to check it.
It's fine. It's only 10 minutes long, and I was also really sick at the time, so I can't bring myself to watch it because I think I did poorly. But anyway, it's there if you want to go see it. So your studio, Try Again. How many of you are there?
4.
Yeah. So with 4 people, like, as long as everybody's on the same page, it doesn't matter how you document it, right? Your documentation could be a Slack channel. It could be communication just with voice, as long as everyone's on the same page.
Yeah.
As the team size gets bigger, getting people on the same page gets harder. But you also have to ask, like, especially when you get AAA size, I'm like, does it really matter if everybody is on the same page? Or does everybody have to be on the same page on what they need to know about, right? Like, there's obviously, like, this global, everyone needs to know what the game is. Like, everyone needs to have that shared vision of the game. That's really high level, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like I find that when it comes to, like, production and stuff like that, there is a lot of documentation that is made, and, like, as a designer, you know that a lot of it's wasted work because nobody reads it, or it gets outdated, and it's like, oh god, I have to update this thing, and it's like, I don't even know who wrote it. No one has the original Photoshop file, and, you know, it's all over the place. So my philosophy, this was actually what my talk was about actionable documentation.
Mm-hmm.
I was mostly referring to when you're actually producing the game, as opposed to, like, pre-production where you're trying to figure out what the game is. Let's just assume everyone knows generally what the game is. And my advice has always been, or what I find that actually works, is you just write documentation as you need it, not beforehand. Right? Like, like let's say you have a level and you know it's going to end in this badass boss battle where this cave monster comes up and, you know, I don't know, shoots projectiles at the player. It's like, okay, we know generally that that's what the boss battle is. Write a brief spec so that, you know, the lead and maybe the concept artists or whatever can, like, okay this and be like, okay, this is a thing we'll do. But until you actually get, especially in AAA, until you actually get a concept artist, until you actually get an animator and a character modeler, until you get a programmer who's actually going to implement it, until that level exists and there's a spot for that boss monster to go, don't go into any more detail, because by the time you get to that detail, it'll be 5 months later and a whole bunch of things have changed about your game. And that's when the rework happens. Like, I would always argue is, like, unless you need to, like, have a general reason to inform everyone, it's okay to just have, like, this really basic idea to inform people with, and then only go into the detail when the details are needed.
You're a very professional system designer. Exactly what is your duties as one, and how do you do it?
Oh boy. So, sorry, I'm yawning now. Just had to do a stretch. It depends on the project. And because my project's under NDA, I can't give you any specifics about what I'm doing for systems. I can, though, tell you about what I did for systems on Sunset Overdrive. To kind of give you an idea of what systems means, like, day to day. So on Sunset, when I moved over onto the project, I was the first time they had a full-time systems designer to do systems, and I don't think anyone really knew what that meant. So what it really meant was every time there was a system that did not fall into level design or mission design or combat, then it ended up on my plate. So systems there meant everything from placing collectibles in the world to how collectibles worked, to the economy, you know, like what kind of loot drops and what does that loot buy you at the vendor. How do vendors work? What do vendors sell? When do they sell them? For how much? It was also things like rewards, right? Every time you complete a mission, you get a reward. You get some sort of, like, resource reward. So in Sunset Overdrive, it was like overdrive and cash, and then sometimes you got items. You got clothing, or sometimes an upgrade weapon. And that was for every mission in the game. But then there was every quest in the game, and then there was every challenge in the game. And a lot of my work was sort of wrangling, like, I used to say that I ran all the lists of the things in the game. So I had the lists of all the weapons in the game and exactly when they came out, what was their rollout, how much they cost, if they were sold, if they were won, if they were multiplayer only, that sort of rollout. And that was sort of like information that the whole team used. And when that would change, usually I ended up in the meeting where it changed. I wasn't making the change itself. Somebody else was, usually the lead or something like that. But then I would be updating the documentation, making sure it fits with all the other different puzzle pieces that make an open world game. So that's kind of like what I did, and it was a little bit all over the place. It's a little bit unusual. Like I said, we were just sort of inventing it as it goes on. Most systems designers, like, we associate systems with balancing. So if it's a game like Hearthstone, right?
Yeah.
If you're playing Hearthstone, you have to balance those cards. How much mana does the card cost? How much damage does it really do? How much health, how much defense does it have? And then playing it over and over and over again, or doing even mathematical models in Excel to judge those numbers and see, okay, is this actually balanced? So a lot of systems design involves balancing. It could also mean things like balancing, how many bullets goes into this gun, and how quickly can you shoot the gun, and how accurate is it? And it's like the whole combination of all those things too is a set of balancing. And so those tend to be all kinds of like systems design tasks.
So you got to test them on the engine to ensure that, right?
Oh yeah.
You don't just write them down and like, it'll be okay.
No. Well, so usually what we'll do, so here's what I found really interesting, and maybe different systems designers work differently, but systems design is half data based and half intuition, and the intuition is sometimes more than a half. If you're playing a game and you're shooting a gun, it's like, this doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
That's intuition. It doesn't feel right. There's something off. You tweak numbers, and sometimes the number tweaking you do is by intuition. Sid Meier, who was I think he's the creative director at Firaxis, he always says, he's got this great quote where he said, to when you're making a change to a number, double it or have it. Don't make incremental changes. Like, make big changes to the number to see whether or not those big changes are what you need. Then you can make more incremental ones. So you make big changes, and then you test those changes and be like, okay, that feels better. That seems about right. But you can't really rely just on yourself. You really need, like, we would always rely on QA testers to go through and play a bunch. And then, usually we're some sort of like debug features where we could say, okay, turn the debug feature on, and it'll record from the beginning of our session to the end of the session how much money they earn, right? And then we can also tell, how many kills they made, and what kind of kills, and like what objectives they, like, all the different things that we could track. And then I'll get all that information. I'll try to analyze that information from our QA people. Other companies have like much more robust, I think Ubisoft's one of them, but I haven't seen any of it, much more robust like automated testing and like telemetry systems that like literally you get the map that has like a heat map of where everyone died, where everyone survived, where people spent their time, where people earned all their money. So you can kind of see like a visual balancing of the game that way. And those are really cool. So that's like one kind of systems design. The kind of systems design that I find myself doing a lot more is a lot more of wrangling complex systems into some kind of shape. So an example, this is not what I worked on Sunset Overdrive, but it's a good example of it, right? Because there wasn't a lot of number tweaking going on. There was some, but one of the designers worked on what we call dynamic encounters, and those were, if you're just flying down the street, and then you look down the street, and there's this big heavy guy with, I forget, oh man, it's been so long, I forgot all the enemy types, right? With a bunch of zombies. I know they're not zombies, a bunch of mutants around them, and they're just like hanging out. That's a dynamic encounter that randomly spawned based off of certain parameters. And maybe you're running down and you're seeing a bunch of humans looting a store. Maybe you're seeing humans and a faction fighting each other. Maybe you see like a robot blockade in one of the areas. All those were dynamic encounters, so they may or may not be there. So they all had to be designed. Here are the different kinds of encounters the players can find. Okay, so this is when these different encounters unlock. You may not see robots early on in the game because they're kind of the end game enemy type. But you'll see them in this area, right? Because we want this area harder than the other area. This is all sort of like this sort of balancing thing. And so there's this level, and then like, well, how many enemies are going to spawn? And it's based off of like, how many enemies is the player recently killed? Did they kill a ton of enemies? Well, maybe we'll have a break and we won't throw a bunch more enemies. We'll make the dynamic encounters a little bit easier for the next, whole 30 seconds of playtime or whole 2 minutes of playtime, right? Before we before we start generating more complex ones and harder ones again for them to encounter. And supply drops from the sky were also dynamic encounters. We didn't know whether or not they would happen, but so that was sort of like the high level design, and the low level part of that design was going in to the street and placing the volumes that said, okay, this is where enemies can fight. Here is a little controller that says, okay, four zombies will come out, and then there's a chance of a wave 2 of 20 zombies, because you know how zombie hordes work, right? They just right. Or maybe the wave was, okay, here's a supply drop, and the first wave may or may not occur, and it will be a bunch of enemy, bunch of looters, right, who are going to be running over to it. And then the second wave will be even heavier looters. Or maybe the first and second wave will happen at the same time, and one wave is looters and one wave is zombies. So there's a lot of detail, going in and saying, okay, here's where the supply drop drops. Here are where the enemies will take up position if they spawn, but we don't know if they're going to spawn, and we don't know if the supply drop's going to drop. So there's a lot of what we call just markup in the world, to mark up the whole world with information that the enemies and that these dynamic encounters could use to make intelligent decisions. There's a trade-off a lot. Between how much do you make designers do in terms of placing these little volumes and these little triggers and these little markup around the world, and how much do you rely on programming to program really good AI to intelligently use the world without that markup, right? And there's always a balance going on. My experience at Insomniac was that they always favored more markup because they wanted the most intelligent seeming AI possible. And the more information you could give the AI, the better they could act. So we did a lot of markup in Sunset Overdrive, and so that's sort of the two bookends of systems design. Is that big overarching, okay, we need these dynamic encounters, and this is how they kind of work, to just going in and literally placing the details of them moment by moment into the world.
Yeah. Now, Insomniac is always the best at designing weapons. Can you talk about techniques and process that ended up those amazing weapons in Sunset Overdrive?
Yeah, so I think Insomniac gets away with a lot because they're known for awesome weapons. So people who want to make awesome weapons tend to apply in Insomniac, and they're like, oh, want to make awesome weapons? Well, we make awesome weapons. Come make more awesome weapons with us. So we've got really good weapon designers.
Evolution always is also great as weapon design.
Yeah.
You're working with it all.
Yeah, but only for a short period there. So Sunset Overdrive, so they take weapons really seriously. They take that moment-to-moment feel of shooting a weapon really seriously. And a lot of focus from the lead designer and game director is put on that. So on Sunset, so the way it normally works is, everyone knows the kind of game, and we have a general ideas mailing list that everybody can throw their ideas in. And usually there's things so on Sunset Overdrive, the person who owned weapons was named Doug Sheehan, and he's actually a programmer, one of the few programmers that I will deign to admit is also an excellent designer. There's very few of those who can do both. And so he was the weapons programmer and technically the weapons designer. And so he would throw in a thread and be like, we need ideas for weapons. Give us ideas for weapons. And people would they would make up ridiculous things. None of my ideas were ever picked, by the way. Still want my popcorn.
Seriously?
Yeah. So none of my ideas were ever picked because I'm not the best at weapon design. It's not my thing. It's not the thing that I will play with other people's weapons. But me for weapon design, I sat next to Doug for all of Sunset Overdrive, so I learned a lot about weapon design from him. A lot of it comes down to figuring out what role the weapons have and making sure that those roles are all filled nicely, right? So shotguns have a certain role in combat. They're high powered but short distance, short range weapons. And then your sniper rifle is the opposite. Well, maybe it's not the opposite. It's also high powered, but it's long range, but there's cooldown effects and stuff like that. Sunset Overdrive was a game definitely full of explosive weapons and various types of explosions, and a lot of that had to deal with the fact that we were dealing with hordes of enemies, right? Enemy hordes, and you were moving really, really fast. So we wanted the player to be able to kill a lot of guys, but and to move really, really fast and not have to deal with really like it's hard to headshot in Sunset Overdrive. It's really hard to headshot if you're grinding on a grind rail with flames coming off of your sneakers and trying to headshot. So that definitely informed some of the way the weapons were designed. But it was definitely a very iterative process, right? Like we had a whole bunch of ideas for guns. And a lot of them were just, here's the guns that fall into the different types of categories that we need, you know, the assault rifle category. Well, I don't think we ever shipped with an assault rifle, you know, but we shipped with guns that kind of suited that spot. We had the fireworks gun might have been the equivalent of an assault rifle, a widespread, long distance, lots of bullets. But it kind of fit into that slot. And so that was the first thing, was just figuring out what those slots were and then trying to design weapons, good weapons that kind of fit in, but also weapons that fit into like the specifics of the combat, which was largely horde-based combat with large amounts of enemies. So like that's where you get things like the acid spray gun, right? Where you just shoot it down to the ground. You can forget it and ignore it, but it's going to shoot a bunch of guys around. Same with the turret gun, things like that. But like, a lot of people had prior experience making Ratchet and Clank, which has lots of crazy guns. Even Resistance 3 had a few crazy guns. You know, they had a cryo gun there, and they had had a cryo gun. They had a gun that infected people with giant, I don't know, green boils on their skin. It was my favorite one, the plague thrower. That was the plague thrower. It made things, infected people, and they eventually.
I thought the teddy bear weapon was in Sunset Overdrive was your idea. Yes.
No, it wasn't. It was one of the other designers. Yeah. No, not mine. Never mind. I'm one of my but they said no. So there's some things that people are really good at design for. And I love to just get out of their way and let them do that job. And one of those things is like off the cuff brainstorming lots of crazy things. I tend to be, I don't want to say I'm a narrow designer. It's just I like designing within a box and designing within a very concrete, here is my problem space. And when it's like, come up with 100 ideas for X, I'm like, oh God, don't make me do it. But then there's other designers that are like, oh, you asked for 100 and here's 1,000. I'm sorry. And you got to find out which designers that is. So like when we were designing the amps for Sunset Overdrive, and that's all the things that you equip to your traversal slots, right? So that like when you grind fire or lightning, right? And things like that. I was in charge of that system, but I wasn't in charge of designing the individual amps because I wasn't a great brainstormer. But we had another designer who was not doing the amps at all. He was actually doing all the traps. And we were like, okay, hey, Josue, we need a bunch of ideas for amps. Can you make them for us? And he did. He came back with like 200 ideas, and we had a meeting. Perfect. You know, find people who are really good at a thing and exploit their skills at that. You know, my skills are more of, okay, well, we have all these amps. Let's give them to Liz to organize and find a system that they all fit in. That's where my strengths lie.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Now, let's go trivia. What was the last game you played?
The last game I played? Well, does the 2 hours of dying in Bloodborne last night count? The last game that I really, really played, I'm starting Bloodborne now, so that's probably a terrible game to talk about. I haven't played any of the Dark Souls games, so this is my first introduction. It's a terrible, terrible experience. We'll see how it goes. But the last game that I played a ton of was actually Witcher 3. I got through about 45, 50 hours of it before I started running into crash issues, so I've just sort of been like, I'm done. I've got enough. So Witcher 3, I'm not necessarily up. Like, I don't tend to play games when they come out. My backlog is too heavy. And the last time I played, the only games I ever play when they come out are Bethesda games.
Actually, I'm playing one. I'm playing Doom right now.
Oh, you're playing Doom. See, that looks good.
Yeah.
It looks like a lot of fun. And so, like, it's on my list.
It's a game you can chainsaw a demon in half, so it's fucking awesome.
Yeah, but I also grew up to playing Doom, and like this last winter, I was going through the history of FPS games, and I replayed the first 2 Doom, and I'm like, these are really good games. So I have really high expectations of Doom, but based off of my playstyle, it's going to be 3 years before I get around to Doom. I'm so behind. So the last thing I played was Witcher 3. I have a soft spot for RPGs, but there's not a lot, you know. There's not a lot of RPGs that really come out. And And right now we've got Bloodborne sitting down, and what else? Oh, and then Metal Gear Solid 5 I really want to play. It's on my immediate queue.
Great game.
But yeah.
Do you love to work on RPG games? I mean, system design on those games are going to be huge.
Yeah, I mean, RPGs are what got me into. Oh, hey, that's what systems design is. I got to work on a skill tree once on a cover shooter. Elements. There was XP and stuff like that. I do like RPG elements. I'm a little yeah. I think working on RPG would be a lot of fun if I worked on the systems part. RPGs tend to take about twice as long to finish than normal game because of all the story stuff and all the dependencies. And I think I would worry about spending 5 or 6 years on a single game. I think I might balk at that. But yeah, working on RPG systems would be a lot of fun. That's where I learned what a system was from all those all the Final Fantasy games, and each time they would like completely reinvent their skill tree system or their leveling up system.
Yeah.
And I remember that was actually the thing I would look forward to the most in each Final Fantasy game. Was not the story, was not the characters. It was, this game has a sphere grid. That's amazing. Everyone remembers the sphere grid. I'm the only one who liked it, I think. Yeah, I love that sort of stuff.
Yeah, great. Now, thank you so much, Liz. You're the definition of awesomeness, and I love you. And I love your work, and I wish you best in your career and your life.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Talking with you.
Also, me. Thank you for being so patient with me.
Oh yeah, not a problem.
Behind the scenes reason. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Yep, you too. You have a good weekend. Bye-bye.